Good morning to those joining us from Europe, and good afternoon to those joining us from Asia. I'm very pleased to open today's session as part of the Asia Europe training on science and there we go, sorry. I'm very grateful to be opening today's session on Two Worlds, One Mission, How Scientists and Diplomats Practice Science Diplomacy as part of the Asia Europe training on science and technology diplomacy. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Linnea Regnell, and I work at the Education Department here at the Asia Europe Foundation. And together with some of my colleagues, we are the ones coordinating this project on science and technology diplomacy. And I have the honor of emceeing a little bit before I hand over to our moderator for today's session. But before we begin, allow me to give a brief introduction to this webinar series and a little bit about the training as a whole. So the webinar series is designed or has been designed primarily to help early career diplomats and government officials, scientists and science managers to get an insight into this field. So over the past 7 weeks, they have been participating in a long program, as the title suggests, the Asia Europe Training on Science and Technology Diplomacy, under which this webinar series falls under. And we're delighted then with these webinar series to also open up to other people beyond our training cohort to join us. So I'm very grateful to see that we have some attendees here today joining us to learn more about this topic and to familiarize yourself with the key concept that we have at play here and the ways in which the way we interact in this field affect the outputs, whilst also covering some examples from Asia and Europe. So previously, over the past 6 weeks, we've explored a number of different topics. We started with science impacting diplomacy, diplomacy impacting science, innovation and technology diplomacy, and then as of recent last week, we also looked at the ways in which what values, biases, and worldviews affect the way we interact in this space. So how our self-identity takes a play in the way we interact in our professional field. So in case you've missed any of these recordings, any of these sessions, you can watch the recordings on our website, and there will be a QR code towards the end as well, where you'll be able to scan it and see all of the recordings. So today we are here for our 5th and final session on this series. And as I mentioned, under the topic of Two Worlds, One Mission, How Scientists and Diplomats Practice Science Diplomacy, we'll explore how professional cultures, attitudes, and methodologies shape collaboration in this field, and how communication in international scientific and diplomatic contexts play out. We would also like to note some of our training partners here. So this training and webinar series is organized by us here at the Asia Europe Foundation, but it wouldn't be possible without the partnership also from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Denmark and the Central European Scientific Society of Innovation and Technology, or CESIT for short. And we also have had the support from a number of different organizations in Asia and Europe working within this field. So we would like to highlight the Institute of International Science Diplomacy and Sustainability at UCSI University in Malaysia, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, or GESTA for short, the National Innovation Agency of Indonesia, BRIN for short, the International Network of Governmental Science Advice and their Asia sector, and last but not least, the regional focal point for Asia and the Pacific of the International Science Council. With all of this, we've managed to have a great program throughout the past couple of weeks. So again, if you have missed out on any of the sessions, please feel free to visit our website to watch the recordings. But without further ado, we would like to now take the opportunity to hand over the floor to our main people of today's session, which is, of course, our speakers. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Ms. Reka Tosha, who is the director here at the Education Department and who will be moderating today's session. So without that, thank you so much, Reka. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction to today's sessions, Linnea. So warm greetings to everyone from Singapore. It's a pleasure to have you joining for this webinar, where we, at the end of the webinar series of the last session, we really wish to explore the practice, how the two worlds of science diplomacy look like. How do diplomats and how do scientists and academics practice science diplomacy. And even though the title of the webinar is two different words, we believe they are not too far away from each other, and there are many bridges to build and to build mutual understanding and better collaboration between these words. So it's my pleasure to introduce our fantastic speakers today who will be representing one or the other side. So let me start with the introduction of Miss Chandu Chowdhury, ladies first. So Chandu is a British diplomat. She's based in Singapore, and she's the Regional Director for Science and Technology for Southeast Asia at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So she will be the perfect person to represent one world, the world of diplomacy. But she also brings a lot of experience from government, as she had several positions related to science diplomacy in ministries as well prior assuming her post now in Singapore, because before she was also head of office of the chief scientific advisor for the Department for Business and Trade. She was also working as head of international science and technology policy in the Ministry of Defense, so bringing in the security experience. And also she was head of rapid technology projects at the Government Office for Science before, the topic that we discussed more in depth on week 4 on technology diplomacy. So very happy to have you, Chandu, here with us today. And thanks for making the time to join and share your experience with our participants. Then our other distinguished speaker will be Mr. Eric Piaget today. He will be representing the other world, the academia and researchers world. He's currently the science diplomacy coordinator for EUtopia, but he's based at the Vrije University of Brussels. So EUtopia, for those of you who don't know, is a European University Alliance of 10 like-minded universities. So he will be sharing his experience not only from 1, but 10 universities today. But Eric also has a researcher hat himself. He's a researcher at the United Nations University. He's with the Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies, and he's focusing on modern diplomacy and how is it practiced, especially non-traditional diplomacy. So we look forward to learn from you more about this as well. And I also have to add that he's been also the chair of the EU Science Diplomacy Alliance in 2022, a co-chair. So he knows quite a bit about European regional efforts and how to harmonize science diplomacy efforts. But he also has insights on the government side because prior he worked for the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and for the Unrepresented Nations of Peoples Organizations, UNO, before. So very, very happy to have you here with us, Eric, and sharing your insights and experience as well. So we will hear 2 quick presentations from both of you, and then we will engage in a discussion together with our attendees. Thank you so much for joining us from Asia and Europe. So let me suggest that we start with Chandu's presentation first.
Absolutely. Let me just bring it up for you. I'm just sharing my screen. Can you see that?
Yes, very well. I'm going to full screen mode.
Okay. So I will just go back to the front. So thank you so much, Rika. It's a pleasure to be here to be able to talk to you and participate in this webinar. I'll talk a little bit about how the UK does international science and technology collaboration, and I'll also talk a little bit about the Science and Technology Network that I head up in Southeast Asia.
It's fantastic, Chandu. Just before you start, could you please reshare your screen, because actually it's frozen on my side. I'm afraid
yes.
also on the participants' side.
Of course. Let me just stop that and then restart. Give me one moment. Are you able to see it now?
We see the first slide, and if you can put it in presentation mode.
Yep, I've put it in presentation mode. Can you see it?
Oh, well, I can't. Can I check with Eric and Linnea?
It's I see it, but not in presentation mode.
Yeah.
It's still.
Okay, then maybe let's just stick to non-presentation mode. It's also we can see it like this as well. This seems to be the problem.
Okay, can you see me changing the
Yes,
tab?
yes, we can let's leave it like this.
Okay, I'm really sorry about that. Maybe I can try and make it a bit bigger. Maybe we can go with that.
Okay, better. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we position ourselves internationally and what science and diplomacy means for the UK. I'll also talk a little bit about the methods that we use in order to inform our thinking when it comes to the actual science collaborations that we're doing. And then I'll talk a little bit about our science and technology network. So I put this slide here because I wanted to highlight the long history that the UK has when it comes to science and technology. And this is something that we aim to do across the piece. So using the heritage that the UK has when it comes to science and technology. So for example, in 2024, we had the development of graphene. In 1953, we had DNA structures discovered. 2012, we had the Raspberry Pi launched. And this helps us as diplomats working abroad to understand the long history that the UK has, but it also helps us to position ourselves strongly because we're able to showcase that we are a trusted partner. We have a long heritage, a long history of working in science and technology. This is a nice visual to take us from 1930 to 2022 when DeepMind published their AlphaFold protein breakthrough. We use other strategies and we use government positioning more broadly in order to inform our thinking when we're working in country. So one thing that I wanted to talk about today was the modern industrial strategy. So the modern industrial strategy was published earlier this year, and it has 8 different strands to it. And you might think if it has 8 different strands to it, it might not necessarily be that applicable to science or technology in particular, but science and technology is something that runs through this entire strategy. The 3 main areas out of the 8 that it is most applicable to is digital and technology, life sciences, and clean energy. So as a science diplomat working not in Whitehall, not in headquarters, I consider it my responsibility to look at this modern industrial strategy, understand what the UK is saying, and then use that work to inform my thinking. And I can talk a little bit about what these sectors mean, just to give you a understanding of what we're actually doing. So under the digital and technologies pillar, you've got advanced connectivity, you've got this as a priority. You've got artificial intelligence, implementing the AI opportunities plan, in engineering biology, enabling new products to market in defense and healthcare, in semiconductors. We've got supporting supply chain resilience and collaborating internationally. And we've also got 22.6 billion investment that's going to be pumped into research and development by 2029 to 2030. Under life sciences, the UK has a very strong ecosystem when it comes to life sciences. There's particular prioritization on mRNA vaccines, antimicrobial resistance, engineering biology, which I mentioned a little earlier, AI to accelerate through life sciences. And the overall vision is to be the top in Europe by 2030 and the third globally in life sciences by 2035. Clean energy, again, you might think that falls more under climate, but the Science and Technology Network works across healthcare, technologies, and climate. So clean energy is also applicable to us, growing offshore wind technologies, offshore wind, nuclear fusion, carbon capture, and then ensuring that we've got the right technologies that support these first tier priorities, stuff like solar, bioenergy, long duration energy storage, and smart systems. And then the overall aim here is to deliver 2.5 billion research and development funding over the next 5 years into fusion energy. So when I read, as a science diplomat, when I read the industrial strategy, I'm really thinking about how the strategy is telling me what the UK wants me to do. And I'm using that as an example to propel my collaborations and the research or work or activities, whatever it might be that I want to do in country. I can delve into the industrial strategy a little more, but I am conscious of the fact that this is not a webinar about the industrial strategy, so I won't dig into it that deeply. But I wanted to highlight what our role as science diplomats are and give you a bit of a practical flavour of that. So there are certain themes in the industrial strategy. One of those themes is global collaboration. And the Science and Technologies Network's role within that is to facilitate bilateral and multilateral science diplomacy, enabling the UK industries to access global markets and talent. So this could mean working bilaterally, let's say Singapore with the UK, but it could also mean working in the multilateral space through ASEAN, which would enable us to hit more countries and share more of our working, more of our desire to access certain markets. So that's one way that we can do it. Future growth sectors. So it's a priority for the industrial strategy to support high growth sectors like clean energy, digital tech, and life sciences. And our role here is to promote UK leadership in these sectors through international workshops, tech missions, and policy dialogues. When it comes to research and development, we, as I mentioned in my previous slide, we're increasing investment in R&D to support technological adoption across the piece. And our role as diplomats in a foreign country is to connect researchers and innovators to ensure that the right talent is coming into the country, the right funding mechanisms are coming into the country, and we're able to build resilient collaborations that can stand the test of time. I think it's been proven time and time again that you can't do research in isolation. It's important to collaborate with other people that are different to yourself. And that's where a science diplomat's role is absolutely integral. And then we have this thing called place-based growth. And what that's about is leveling up certain parts of the UK. That is something that is drilled in you as a diplomat, whether you are a science diplomat or a trade diplomat or an economics diplomat. And our role here is to highlight regional strengths. So to say that there are certain aspects, there are certain areas within the UK that have regional strengths and direct companies or researchers or talent to those particular areas. So we're getting the most out of the people that are coming to the UK, and the people that are coming to the UK are getting the most out of the UK. We also have other things that we use to inform our thinking. We have the Science and Technology Framework. So this is published on gov.uk. If you're interested in it, you can go and have a look at it. And I'll just talk you through the sort of pipeline of what it describes. So if we start with investing in talent and skills, we then want to ensure that we're collaborating internationally to maximize potential. We then want to ensure that there are regulations and standards both in the UK and internationally that allow us to ensure that there are interoperable systems. We want to have financing innovation and for science and tech companies to ensure that they can come to the UK, they can establish themselves, and they can find a prosperous home in the UK. And we want to develop and deploy critical technologies through bringing in international talent, collaborating internationally, developing those regulations and standards, ensuring that we have the right companies in the UK. And finally, we want to signal those UK strengths and ambitions to the rest of the world. It's a really interesting document. If you have time and you're interested in the UK in particular, I would give it a read. The final thing about the strategies that we use that I'll talk about is the growth mission. This is again published on gov.uk. If you're interested, you can go and you can have a read through it. Not all of it is applicable to science and technology, but there are 6 main growth missions. Those are building strong foundations of the UK, economic growth, NHS fit for the future, safer streets, breaking down barriers to opportunity, and making Britain a clean energy superpower. Now, you might think that the vast majority of those have absolutely nothing to do with science and tech. And I would say that you're wrong. So economic growth, science and technology is one of the main drivers in ensuring that we have the right talent, the right people, the right industry, and that we're innovating. Innovation can equal growth, especially at the later stages of innovation when you're thinking about companies and startups. NHS fit for the future, how does science fit into that? So science fits into that when you think about efficiencies that can be made when it comes to cutting down wait times. If there are, for example, other devices that can be used that can help a doctor get to a medical solution sooner than doing multiple rounds of tests. For example, it could be a Fitbit, it could be a smartwatch, etc. Breaking down barriers to opportunity, making sure that we have the right talent in the country so that we're making the economy as prosperous as possible, so other people have an opportunity to do things that maybe we might not have had the opportunity to do, or other people might not have had the opportunity to do. And then making Britain a clean energy superpower. I think I've spoken about this a bit earlier, but the amount of funding that's going into things like fusion energy, solar and wind power, all of that is innovation, technology and science. I wanted to give a little example of what that means when we deploy some of these strategies in country. So the example that I'm going to share with you is with Thailand. So we don't just use the strategies that I've mentioned, we also focus our collaboration. And this is a very simple chart. I don't want to put too much detail here, but it shows that future telecoms is not a potential strength of Thailand, but engineering biology is. And then I know, because I've read the industrial strategy, that engineering biology is something that the UK wants to do more of. So I should look at potential engineering biology collaborations, or at least try and understand what the landscape looks like. Another example would be Vietnam here. Obviously, the grid is smaller. The economy of Vietnam is smaller than the economy of Thailand, so that's to be expected. But similarly, we can see that, excuse me, quantum computing is smaller than semiconductors. So maybe I should think about reaching out to a semiconductors company or working with the embassy in Vietnam to understand what the semiconductor landscape looks like there to see if there's potential opportunities. The data is slightly more granular the deeper you look. I'm pretty sure you won't be able to see the extent of technologies written there because I haven't been able to share my screen more widely. But if you just see this as a page that looks at particular technologies and a score that's given by the Government Office for Science, this helps a science diplomat in understanding exactly where we should focus our attention. The final bit of this presentation is how you can work with the UK government and what the Science and Technology Network does. So the Science and Technology Network in Southeast Asia sits in 6 countries. So I'm based in Singapore, but I have teams in Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And the areas that we're particularly interested in are set by Whitehall. So they are AI, semiconductors, engineering, biology, quantum computing, advanced connectivity, climate, and healthcare. And when you are a diplomat based abroad, you have to make a judgment decision as to whether these particular areas, let's say advanced connectivity, is that something that my country back home will want me to invest time and energy in? Is it something that will get traction with Whitehall? Will it help us achieve the goals that we have written in the industrial strategy? And the way that you do that is by using the network that you have, ensuring that you're having the right conversations with companies, researchers, to understand what the scope is and seeing if that marries well with what the UK wants. I'm also just going to talk a little bit about other people that we partner with. So we have a rich history of academies in the UK. So we work with the Royal Academy of Engineering and we highlight certain things that they're doing. So they have a Leaders in Innovation Fellowship, which opens on the 26th of August. We have the British Academy, which is the UK's National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences, and we work with them to ensure that they have access to people within Southeast Asia to highlight their workshops and their research grants that they have. We have the Academy of Medical Sciences, and Academy of Medical Sciences does a lot of work in Southeast Asia. So they also have leadership programs that we highlight to Southeast Asia. They also have particular research pathways, and they do a whole range of stuff on genomics and precision medicine. And then the Royal Society. The Royal Society is the world's oldest scientific academy, and we highlight the research fellowships that they have. We highlight the work that they're doing in country, and we socialize the importance of these particular academies because they also form part of the core UK offer abroad. As science diplomats. Also back to the other screen. So I hope that's okay with everyone. Stop sharing. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Chandu. It was really interesting to see how you walked us through and the different strategies that shape your priorities. And it was also very interesting to learn about the work of the Government Office of Science, who's supplying you with all these data sets, and also the other partners who form part of your collaboration ecosystem and at the core of the UK offer abroad, as you just said. A quick follow-up question. Are these data sets openly accessible from the Government Office of Science, or is it only for your information?
Yeah, so as you probably saw, I took a lot of the meaning of the data out of those charts. I don't think that data has been published yet. I believe they would like to publish some data, but it's just going through some final security and vetting. If you search the Government Office for Science in gov.uk, you should be able to see what they have published. I think likely what you'll find is lots of reports on different technologies and what they actually mean. So if anyone is interested in the UK's position of what engineering biology is, for example, you'll be able to go and you'll be able to see what that is, and you'll also be able to see some interesting data sets on those particular technologies. But I think as a whole, on country by country, that hasn't been published yet.
Okay, that's fantastic because I just believe some of our participants might be interested in that, so it's good to know for them. Thank you so much, and then let me invite Eric to take the floor now and give us insights into the other world of academia and universities.
Thank you very much, Rika, and thank you, Shandu. That was a very insightful presentation. Okay, so can you all see that? Is that full screen and ready to go? Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and talking to all of you. I'm going to just talk for 10, 15 minutes about the fourth dimension of science diplomacy. I'm not sure if you've come across this in your trainings yet, but this is sort of the aspect of science diplomacy that sees the diplomatic role kind of transferred to that of the scientist. So I think first we do a little bit of a recap about how this came to be. And I think a good place to start is at the end of the Cold War, which is in this period that you're probably familiar with, the end of history. It's a postulation from Francis Fukuyama, a political scientist from Harvard, who said, now that the Cold War is over, more and more countries are turning to liberal democracies. Liberal democracies don't go to war, and therefore we've reached the end of history. And some ways to illustrate that, I thought, were the fall of the Berlin Wall, or here we have the in the center the Malta summit, which was the official end of the Cold War, and the McDonald's opening on Red Square, and the economic reforms in China from Deng Xiaoping, and then Boris Yeltsin and Bill Clinton having a warm embrace, and then the growth of globalization, as illustrated on the bottom, with all of these new air routes. So it was in this period that science diplomacy as a concept really started to emerge. And you're probably already familiar with the Royal Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science's three-part taxonomy. But just a quick recap: science in diplomacy is the scientific knowledge and advice that guides the diplomatic process. Diplomacy for science is when diplomatic actions can pave the way for more scientific collaborations, and science for diplomacy is when science can help facilitate warmer diplomatic relations. So this was all, wonderfully received, and it generated lots of positivity. But then we've kind of reached the end of history, and that looking at science in the sort of soft power dimensions isn't sufficient. So in the end of history, we have, arguably you could have said the attacks on 9/11 were kind of a watershed moment for this, and then the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which without a UN Security Council mandate started to erode sort of the rules-based international order. The financial crisis in 2008 really started to erode trust in institutions. The Sino-American rivalries and the Ukraine war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think further put strain on this rules-based international order, this multilateral rules-based order, when science diplomacy first kind of came into the mainstream of discussions. And the pandemic, I think, put a lot of strain on the trust in science, and it was a great spurring moment for anti-scientism. As we can talk about a little bit more later. And now we're living in this global disorder, which I think the things that I think illustrate that is this shift from multilateralism to multipolarity. And then the rise of populism is a big strain on the domestic sides, which then feeds into diplomatic well, basically when the populist movements are rising at home, it's much harder to cooperate on the global stage. And the proliferation of armed conflicts, as you can see on the top right, it's rising. And according to the Peace Research Institute Oslo, it's the most conflicts right now since 1947. And to kind of illustrate this multipolarity, you see all of these different clubs as opposed to one single club. But you have the BRICS, or the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or the Axis Upheaval, or in NATO terms, it's the strategic convergence of China and Russia and North Korea and Iran. And then on the other hand, NATO and the G7, European Union, Australia, UK, US agreement, etc. And meanwhile, the United Nations at its highest levels is very, very gridlocked. The Security Council can't really develop any resolutions in a meaningful way anymore. And to complement that, you see the rise of non-state actors that have, budgets that surpass many countries. And the EU's mantra to international scientific collaboration was always as open, now as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Replaced the three O's that kind of defined it when we were in this end of history period. The three O's: open innovation, open science, open to the world. And now, in the end of history, it's as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And it seems that being as closed as possible is becoming necessary. So I think, what does this mean for science diplomacy? This is a very nice analytical grid that my colleague Jean-François Doulet made. He's a diplomat at the French embassy in Ottawa. And on the x-axis, you can see kind of the difference between openness and closedness. And on the y-axis, competition and cooperation. And so when things are open and cooperative, that is what we could see as ideal science diplomacy. And on the bottom, you can see there's a high degree of connectivity. But when things are competitive and open, that's what you call crisis science diplomacy. I think during the pandemic is a very good example of crisis science diplomacy, where, for example, lots of data about coronavirus was made open, but there was still a great deal of competition in terms of developing the vaccine first. And then when you have cooperation but closeness, you have the like-minded science diplomacy, which is very much this multipolarity thing where you have different clubs working together. And then the sovereign science diplomacy, or when things are very competitive and are very closed. And I think the fear is we're moving much more into this quadrant, considering all of the panic that exists with regards to dual use and research security and the rise of scientific sanctions. Because just to go back to the previous slide, you can see the number of sanctions has been increasing very steadily. So if this is the case, what does it mean for science diplomacy? Is the purpose of science diplomacy to promote economic and security interests of the country? Or is it to advance a global agenda that treats science as a global public good? I think this is a very interesting question that was raised by Peter Gluckman and von Tuikian. And if it is for the global good, then what happens to the global science? The global commons, rather. Who cares about the global commons? And the traditional five global commons are the high seas, Antarctica, the atmosphere, outer space, and cybersecurity. But arguably, science and knowledge underpins all of those, and itself should also be considered part of the global commons. So this is what caused my two colleagues. On the right, it's Luc van Langenhoven, my mentor, and on the left, Jean-Claude Bergelman. Both are professors here at the VUB, Free University of Brussels. And back in 2021, they argued that nobody speaks up for the global commons of knowledge, and that is precisely what scientists could do. So to be the diplomatic spokesperson of the global commons of knowledge, to be ambassadors of science, to have the diplomatic skills to advocate on behalf of the science that they impart. And this is very much needed to combat anti-scientism, to repair fragmentation that is proliferating, to raise the impact on societal debates, and to then bring that into dialogue with policymakers. To kind of take this example of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is 1,000 scientists around the world synthesizing all of the scientific data on climate change and then turning that into actionable policy recommendations. To take that and to bring it to all institutions dealing with science is kind of how they envision this. And this fourth dimension even made it into the EU framework for science diplomacy, which takes the traditional three, but then also adds diplomacy in science, using diplomatic skills and tools in and by science. But to do that, universities play a very, very big role, because scientists and researchers, they're unlikely to kind of take on this role as ambassadors of science by themselves. So universities have this potential to broaden the participation and prioritize science diplomacy within their institutional structures, and encourage scientists and researchers that are working there to take on this role. But of course, that's not going to happen by itself. So universities would really need to tweak some aspects within, for example, the career incentives and the reward systems, which are a little bit more centered around citations and publications than it is on advocating on behalf of the global commons of science. But of course, for universities to flourish, we really do need to have science as open as possible and to freely share ideas. So, according to Van Langenhove and Bergelman, universities can play these four big steps by investing more in synthesizing scientific knowledge, and then to reward efforts with career developments and opportunities, to connect scientific knowledge with policy makers and civil society, and then, meanwhile, to consistently reflect on the progress that they're doing, because there is such a thing as bad science diplomacy. And at Utopia, which is, as Reka really gave you a good introduction of what it is, but yeah, 10 universities, and we have this work package on science diplomacy, which is basically tasked with looking at how universities can operate in the science diplomacy field. To do that, we've had a series of events to kind of raise awareness and build this culture of science diplomacy. And we also recently wrote a report with funding from the Agence Universitaire de la Francophonie to look at what are the mechanisms that enable science diplomacy actorness, which we define as the capacity of a university or a network of universities to position themselves as science diplomacy actors, shaping the field through their institutional structures. And these are the 8 domains. So international collaborations, that is one way where universities can really create scientific and also diplomatic links. And then diplomatic partnerships, evidently, well, I think it's quite self-evident. And then international students and researchers and alumni networks kind of show the attraction of that university from the wider world, and then also its influence among influence among alumni, which can serve as sort of unofficial diplomatic core. International research funding shows how the university can attract funds and build international consortia. Foreign and science policy influence, how well connected they are to different channels of policymakers. And then public engagement shows how it helps build up the culture of science in its community. And then curricula is a one very dear to my heart, because I think science diplomacy is a very serendipitous field where people like myself, I studied history and international relations, and then sort of stumbled into the scientific dimension. Meanwhile, many of my colleagues are natural or applied scientists by training, and then realize the diplomatic dimensions of their work. But there's not really a cohort of science diplomats that are trained from the very beginning. Apart from a few universities like Georgetown and Johns Hopkins and I think Dartmouth, and there are a few universities that have programs that sort of link science and diplomacy very closely together from the very beginning. But for the most part, it's still quite absent. So this is another big area for universities to focus on in becoming science diplomacy actors. And to just, I thought to include this. This is from Lorenzo Melchor from the National Office of Science in Spain. He wrote this back in 2020 to look at the different knowledge and skills of a scientist and of a diplomat. And I think universities play a very big role in strengthening the skills and knowledge of both of those, and kind of combining them more closely together to create a a, a science diplomat from the beginning. And then just as a little case study, I went to a conference last week, and it was very fascinating to hear about UNIMED, the Union of Mediterranean Universities, which is 162 universities in 25 countries. But now they have this sub-network on climate. So it's basically a way for them to address like shared climate risks and ecological challenges in a region that is very, very politically diverse, and also heavily affected by the effects of climate change. And these universities in this network, they act as the bridges between the countries that they're based in, and try to promote dialogue and this joint research and innovation in climate change adaptation. And they do this through organizing joint projects and dialogues, linking academia and government, building capacity for climate transition, and encouraging exchange and co-authored research. So together, I think these universities and this sub-network on climate, it's a very, very good example of how universities can really bridge the fields between science and diplomacy, and keeping it within that quadrant of ideal science diplomacy. And because science, I think, needs to be connected to truly flourish. So yeah, that concludes my brief talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for this wonderful presentation, starting with the big picture and how science diplomacy is evolving at the end of history and the end of history. And it was really interesting to learn about the fourth dimension of science diplomacy that you introduced us, and also the quadrants of how competition, collaboration, openness, and closeness influence the type of science diplomacy that is being carried out. This is also something we often discuss in these webinars and the workshops throughout the training. So that was very insightful. And then also giving us very concrete examples and domains how universities act in science diplomacy, and how Utopia is framing these pool of actions and tools available to them. So let me encourage our audience to start putting their questions in the Q&A function, and we will be happy to take them up. But let me kick off our conversation with some questions from me first. So Eric mentioned among the 8 domains of how universities can act in science diplomacy that one of the domains is building diplomatic relationships. So let's explore this concept a little bit. From Chandu's side, I would like to know how you work with universities and what is a good partnership for you with universities. And from Eric's side, that who should build this partnership at the university? Is it leadership? Is it all scientists, or somewhere in between? And what are the key principles of how to do this right from the academia's point of view? So let me invite Chandu to reflect on that first.
Well, sorry, could you repeat the question?
So Eric shared with us that one of the key actions or domains how universities can engage in science diplomacy is building diplomatic partnerships. So with diplomats, and we would like to know that from your perspective as a science diplomat, how does a good partnership with a university look like?
Mm-hmm. So we have many partnerships with universities, and I think it really depends on what the university wants to achieve. So we've had some universities recently come to the British High Commission in Singapore, and they've highlighted that they would like to have a better understanding about the ecosystem, what types of academic qualifications people in Singapore are able to get, because they want to build up their talent pipelines. They want to get people, international students, into their campuses back in the UK. So that's one type of relationship. It's more on the business side, but it's one type of relationship that we see quite often. The other type of relationship that we see is when we're trying to do academic collaborations. So I joined my post in February of this year. And one of my first engagements that I did was that my team in Indonesia wanted me to come out to talk about this particular researchers, to introduce this researcher to another university. So I went out, and this researcher was looking at diabetes in different minority groups. And diabetes is something that costs the National Health Service hundreds of thousands of pounds every single year. It's something that is not getting better with an aging population, and it's something that affects people of all different areas, really. And this was a researcher working in Queen Mary University in London who had done research in multiple South Asian countries and wanted to start working in Indonesia. So, with my diplomatic hat on, I looked at the research that she was doing, why she was doing this research, what the UK would get out of it, what Indonesia would get out of it. And through the British Council, we were able to make connections with people who could help further her data sets. Part of the research that she was doing that made it particularly impactful for Indonesia was that she was looking at different minority groups. And if there are any people listening who are from Indonesia, you'll know that Indonesia has lots and lots and lots of different minority groups. So understanding how diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, represents in those particular groups, and allowing her the space to do that with the expertise that she's already built up is another way of how we connect universities. I think in the more kind of academic space, it's really useful for universities to try and get their students some hands-on experience, because I think it's one thing to be able to talk about like building connections and deepening relationships, but it's a completely other thing to be able to translate that into real world, impactful collaborations that can achieve benefits for people. So yeah, just some high level ideas there.
And
Yes.
And the question with regards to who should build these diplomatic partnerships, I think it can really go on all levels. But of course, when there's more of a centralized dimension from the, well, for example, at the VUB, we have international relations office with the diplomatic relations team. So we have a big database of lots of different embassies, and then we also have good connections with all of our researchers, and we can sort of pair what the needs of the researchers are with, if there's the need from a diplomatic support in a different embassy, then we can do that pairing. So of course, when it's also encouraged on the individual researcher basis, to build partnerships to help advance your research. But when it goes through the centralized structure, then it's like this pairing scheme that works much more seamlessly. Yes, I suppose. Well, we do have quite sometimes visits from the ambassadors of different embassies, and they would meet with the rector or the vice rector for international relations. But on a personal level, I also have a very good connection with different embassies in Brussels. I really like to go to meet which any embassy will invite me to have a coffee and discuss science diplomacy, and then building up a network of different diplomats in Brussels. And then, if any of my colleagues require any assistance or knowledge of one particular area of the world, I can direct them to my network. So I think there's no one right way, but I think the centralized dimension, it creates this pairing scheme, which I think is very important.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. So now you talked about ways of engaging the two worlds with each other, building the bridges. So I would also like to know that how do you know that it was successful? So how do you measure success in science diplomacy in your field, so in the diplomatic service and in academia? And let me also add on one question from the chat from Jintara. She's also asking specifically, Eric, that you showed the 8 domains of how universities engage. So how do you measure whether their engagement in this domain were successful? Are there any indicators in this case, perhaps? Let us start with Chengdu again. How do you measure success?
Yeah, sure. So we've been talking about this quite a lot in the Foreign Office. And part of the reason why we've been talking about it is because of the growth missions that I spoke about earlier. So the growth missions are looking at how much foreign direct investment and how much trade we're bringing back into the UK. And obviously, this is positioned within geopolitics and everything that's happening across the world. It certainly feels like we're in slightly tense times, shall we say. And it's really difficult to be able to highlight exactly how the Science and Technology Network is contributing to a financial sum. And the reason why it's very difficult to do that is because traditional methods of calculating GDP or looking at what type of data the Office for National Statistics collects, we don't typically collect data that can exactly pinpoint the value of early research, early collaboration, and how much is really required in that time, how much research and development funding is required in that time for an idea to become a spin-out, let's say. So an example that I always give is if you look at the Gavi Foundation, or if you look at Bill and Melinda Gates, they are very keen on vaccinations. They had the UK had the Gavi conference a couple of years ago, and most people would agree that vaccinations are the right thing for populations to do. However, what we don't calculate is the benefit of those vaccinations. So we're not calculating things like how many people have gone into hospital less as a result of a malaria vaccine that was administered 3 years prior. We're not calculating how much impact that vaccine has had, because it's not just kept someone out of hospital, but it's also kept someone in work. And it's very difficult to be able to pinpoint exactly what benefit science and technology is doing. However, if you think about it in terms of the tech readiness scale, I don't know if you have heard of that, but you have technologies which are very early. So TRL level, tech readiness level 1 might be something akin to an idea, and tech readiness level 7 would be a commercial opportunity. What we do is we focus on technologies which are low in the tech readiness scale, so that we can help build the pipeline of activities that eventually end up at a commercial level. So without us, you wouldn't really be able to get a idea or a joint collaboration to tech readiness level 7, and therefore a commercial opportunity. So we position ourselves, the metrics that we use are we collaborating with the right people? Have we aligned ourselves as best as we possibly can to the strategies? What is the impact of our work? Is there further collaboration that's happening on top of that? Are we maturing this particular technology so it is moving up the tech readiness scale? But in science, when you're looking at pure science and you're looking at collaboration, you're looking at university to university dialogue, it's hard. It's very hard to put a financial figure on exactly what it is that we're doing. And that is one of the big requirements that we have in the UK.
This is super interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I hope all of those who are coming from academia in this webinar or will listen to the recording later this will be a good pointer on how to think like a science diplomat and how to work with diplomats. What's your take on this, Eric?
Yes, that was very interesting indeed. But success in science diplomacy. Well, I think success in diplomacy and success in science are quite different. Like, I think in diplomacy, a failure is more like a plane crash because you hear about it on the news. But success, it's like a plane landing safely. It happens so often, and you don't hear about it. It's sort of like this under the radar. Like one of the best examples is the Bakazi Peninsula. This peninsula in the Gulf of Guinea. It was the subject of a lot of territorial disputes between Nigeria and Cameroon, and it could have ended up in a really bloody war. But thanks to back channel UN mediation, we don't really know about Bakazi Peninsula as a tragedy. So that it's I think a bit hard to measure diplomatic success, and unless you look at the glitzy banquets and state dinners and all of that. And summits. But otherwise, I think a lot of the successes of diplomacy are quite subtle, and you don't hear about it. Whereas success in science is more visible. It's like measurable, publishable, But when it comes to success in science diplomacy, for me, it's bridges that are built, that bridges that enable science to flow across borders and across sectors. So like co-authored publications or different institutional partnerships or consortia that apply for a project that consists of many different countries and it's successful. Those are how I think that's how you measure success for me in science diplomacy. And how to measure the domains of the 8 domains. Well, I put in the chat the link to the report. Each of the domains, it's a little bit different. Some of them are quite qualitative. Some of them are easy to quantify. For example, the number of international students and researchers, the number of international collaborations that are going on. But when you talk about diplomatic partnerships, then we were asking the international relations offices of the universities. And I think, what is one university's example of a diplomatic partnership? It might be different than another example of a diplomatic partnership. Then we're kind of getting into like the semantics of things, and it might seem a little unnecessary to look at the semantics, but it does really play a big role because what something means to somebody might not mean the same to another person. That's why we talk a lot in science diplomacy. Me and my mentor Luc van Langenhove talk a lot about Wittgensteinian philosophy when it comes to science diplomacy, about what is the meaning of words to one person versus to another person. For measuring the different domains, some of them are based on qualitative interviews, some of them are based on more quantitative metrics. So it really depends. Measuring it's a big challenge, and there's probably better ways to do it. But this was just sort of a start.
Thank you so much. Very interesting how you first made the distinction between success in diplomacy and success on science. And let me build on that because we also have here among the audience Paulo Samoza from the Philippines, and he has a question related to that because you defined success in science to make it as open as possible to allow science to flow. Sorry, that was the success of science diplomacy, scientists and diplomacy together to allow science to flow across borders and contribute to the global good and mitigate the global challenges. But Paulo says that now, especially in the light of this evolving landscape with a lot of tensions that we presented at the beginning, how can actually science diplomacy practitioners, both diplomats and both academia, work together in an environment which is not supporting this open flow of science? and how can we overcome geopolitical competition and institutional tensions between state and especially tech companies? So any take on that?
Yeah, I can comment on that. So I think in my experience, what I've found is that science is something that a lot of people can come behind. If you have a common problem, whether that's vaccination, I think, Eric, you mentioned earlier today, like COVID, if it's a particular disease that people are struggling with, I think because essentially all of humanity is the same, right? I think because science looks at these fundamental problems that impact human beings as a whole, it's easy for scientists to decide that they want to work on stuff. The difficulty comes um, when you add politics to the mix. And I don't just mean politics in terms of geopolitics, but I mean politics in terms of where intellectual property is filed, or where a pharmaceutical company has their base and where they've got the best tax rebates, whatever it might be. I think that's where problems really start. And I would perhaps argue that these are problems that are not just things that have impacted us in the modern day. I think they're things that have gone on for a very long time. But ensuring that we have the right pathways open, that we're making the best connections that we possibly can, and we are allowing a space for scientists to come together to discuss problems that are impacting the UK and other nations. I think that is the role of a science diplomat in this world, in the times that we're living in right now, and also in the times that we will face in the future. And hopefully science diplomats have been doing this in the past as well. Yeah, I think there are obviously other aspects to this, such as security reasons as to why you might not want to partner with a particular nation, and that always needs to be respected. That you should consult with your security directorate in order to make sure that you're doing things as properly as you possibly can. But I generally find that the scientists themselves have a deep desire to work together to overcome problems. But funding and the politics of the world is harder to navigate. But I don't think that's something that we're just experiencing now.
It was a very good answer, Chandu. I don't think I could answer it better myself. But yeah, I would just add on to it by saying that indeed, scientists, I think, if they take on and realize this diplomatic potential in the science that they do, to actually bring diplomacy into their scientific work and try to make it transcend borders and to maintain these international scientific communities that work on shared challenges, but also to be informed on the diplomatic realities and to have diplomats informing scientists, and for scientists to inform themselves on the diplomatic realities, because you can't be naive about certain collaborations. But a very good example I was reading about recently is James Hammond, volcanologist from Birkbeck University, London. And he's been working on Mount Paektu, this volcano in North Korea. It's the only, I think, British North Korean scientific project that is on right now. And in the mid 2000s, when North Korea was doing all of these nuclear weapons tests, and then UN sanctions were put on place, it became it became impossible to continue this project on studying Mount Paektu. But James Hammond was, with the help of the Royal Society, was able, and then I think was lobbying British government at the United Nations, and then allowed to have some exemptions to these sanctions. So that, and he said, I saw him in Brussels month ago talking about he went to North Korea as a scientist, and he left as a science diplomat because realizing the diplomatic dimensions of that work. So yeah, there's definitely the current landscape makes it very challenging, but I think with some creativity and dedication and sort of this holistic approach with many different people on your team in the diplomacy world and in the science world, you can find solutions to get around some of these big barriers.
These are very, very encouraging thoughts. So thank you for both of us, both of you, to encouraging us that there are ways. We just need to think more creatively on how to bridge these divides. Let me bring in another topic or issue. So we are talking about connecting the two words of science and diplomacy, and one of the tools to do that usually science advice when the government or the foreign service is engaging universities or research institutions to inform them related to bigger decisions. And this is also a question from Chair Chung Tom from Malaysia. Because he says that in Malaysia, for example, there is a legal requirement to require this kind of science advice before carrying out bigger passing laws. And we would like to know whether you're aware of how the science advice systems are working in the UK, in Europe, and perhaps also in ASEAN, Chandu. Whether these systems are normally in place, or it's more like the exception to have like a systematic science advice ecosystem where governments are regularly consulting universities.
Could you just repeat the bit about the legal requirement? I didn't entirely follow that bit.
Yeah, so Chen Chung says that, for example, in Malaysia, before a law is drafted or amended, then government will usually commission a university or a research institution or think tank to carry out a study to assess the viability and the impact of the new law. So this is an example of how science advice could work.
Yeah, so we have the Government Office for Science, which is our primary function when it comes to science advice. So the way that it works is that it previously sat as an independent body. So it wasn't attached to any government department. It was an independent body. The people that worked there were civil servants, but it wasn't influenced by policy of any other government department. And you had people such as the government chief scientific advisor. So I don't know if anyone remembers, but during COVID times, the government chief scientific advisor was Patrick Vallance. So you would see Patrick Vallance on the TV quite a lot. And through his direction and through the direction of the Government Office for Science, you would get science advice. This was also influenced by a team of scientists and a team of civil servants. I'm talking about COVID time. So this was influenced by a team of scientists, a team of civil servants led by Sir Patrick Vallance and the medical chief scientific advisor, which was Chris Whitty at the time, to provide advice for COVID-19. I don't know if many of you have heard, but there are things called COBRAs. So this is when there is a disaster or there's a particular issue. There's a meeting that's called at number 10. And during the pandemic, there were many COBRAs which were facilitated by Sir Patrick Vallance and Sir Chris Whitty. So this happened through the Government Office for Science. So the science advice, the calculations on risk, the issues that could prop up as a result of social isolation or as a result of opening up again. It was developed by a team of scientists that sat in a small body called SAGE. SAGE was the space that gave the advice to COBRA, and it would go to number 10. So we had some very clear mechanisms. There are other, and that SAGE works in the same way, SAGE and COBRAs work in the same way So when Grenfell, for example, I don't know if anyone remembers, but the tragedy in West London many years ago now, where some social housing blocks unfortunately caught on fire, and I think 79 to 90 people unfortunately died. There was an investigation as to how that happened. That was also facilitated by SAGE. There were also COBRAs that were done. So we have particular mechanisms whereby we incorporate science advice into societal issues that are taking place. There was another question that you asked towards the end of what you were saying, and I've completely forgotten that question.
Regarding the Southeast Asian countries, if you have any knowledge of such systems being in place.
Yes, so in Southeast Asia, we incorporate science advice through the mechanisms that I was talking about in my presentation. So we have data that is produced again by the Government Office for Science. It looks at patents, so where patents are filed, what those patents look like. We look at academic citation index. So that is how many times a paper has been cited by a particular person that is affiliated to a particular university. And we look at where industry is based. So how many companies are there in Malaysia, let's say, that work on semiconductors, what types of semiconductors they work at, etc. And that is then used to inform our decision on what particular technologies we want to work with a particular country on.
And I suppose I can just give a little bit of context in the European Union and how science advice works here. I mean, I'm not an expert on it necessarily, but we have the European Commission has the science advice mechanism, which is at the request of any of the, because we have the president of the commission and then all of these different commissioners that are responsible for a different portfolio. And at the request of any of those commissioners, the science advice mechanism can be activated to provide scientific evidence and recommendations on a range of issues. So they've had ones related to solar geoengineering, on glyphosate, on cancer medicine. That's the science advice mechanism. And then there's also the SAPIA, which is Science Policy Advice and Ethics, which is also under the science advice mechanism. But that is taking like over 100 different academies and learned societies in Europe that also provide scientific advice and inputs to any sort of policy that is in the pipeline. But maybe more on the science diplomacy itself. With regards to science advice in the formation of the EU framework for science diplomacy, well, the process of that consisted of 5 working groups that were each chaired by a diplomat and a scientist, and brought perspectives from both science and diplomacy together in kind of creating this framework for science diplomacy. So that's a little insight of how it works in Europe.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much. And then let me touch upon a last question before we wrap up, and I will invite you to give your short advice at the end. But the last question, let's focus a little bit on the different mindsets or skill sets or knowledge sets of diplomats and academics. I think Eric had a nice slide on it under the toolbox. There was this research done that what might be the strengths of the diplomat and the academic side, but we can fairly assume that these differences and strengths also sometimes lead to differences and tensions. So if both of you could share a moment when you witnessed that these different mindsets, the scientists or just diplomats, created either a challenge or perhaps a complementary strength in a project that you were working on. And this will also tie in with Muhammad Ardafili's question in the chat. So he's asking about these tensions, and if you can give an example, and then how to overcome these tensions, diversity, and turn it into an asset rather than barrier for collaboration.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. Um, so I'm not a scientist. I am a ex-lawyer, and I think one skill set that really propels me is my legal background. So I am not fazed by legal jargon. I am very happy to negotiate with people, um, and I'm very happy to read lots of laborious text, I guess. Um, I think I think anyone can be a science diplomat, as a matter of fact. I think so long as you have a passion and drive to want to do good and to want to help people, I think that's 50% of being a science diplomat. I've had people in my team, for example, to answer your other question about sort of have you seen any conflict? So I had a really wonderful person in my team who had all of the skills that I didn't feel like I had. So they had a PhD in spintronics. They could understand some really technical stuff that I would not be able to understand, and they were a real asset to the team. And I remember once I said to them, "Okay, this report looks like it's ready, and we need to send it out. So shall we send it out by like 5 p.m. today, close of play?" And they were like, "Yeah, yeah, that's fine. That should be done." And then around lunchtime, I had a look at the report again, and I was like, "It's finished. It's done." Um, and so I sent them a message, and I was like, "Oh, shall we send it out by like 2 p.m. then, if it's done?" And they were basically like, well, then they called me, and they're like, "Oh, I'm like, why? Like, you want it sent out by 2 p.m. Like, why do you want it sent out by 2 p.m.?" I was like, "Oh, I just thought it was done." And I didn't take into account the fact that they've come from a very different world to me. They've come from a world where they have been allowed with very little supervision to work in a lab, to do their spintronic stuff, whatever spintronics is. And they have been, they're not used to this type of environment where if it's ready, let's just go, let's just get rid of it, let's work on the next thing. So I realized that it's actually not just with scientists, right? But wherever someone comes from, whatever walk of life they come from, there's a general adjustment that needs to happen if they're coming into a new place. And I think most recently, I have another very excellent and very intelligent person in my team. Um, they've worked in this team for a very long time, and um, I think they assume that people just know certain things, and that comes from being very absorbed in your work, and that comes from having a very strong academic background in a particular area where people are able to follow very easily whatever it is that you're saying. And I think I had to have a conversation and just say, you might understand certain things and I might understand certain things, but the general public who we need to translate this stuff to are not going to understand. And I think it's just about having emotional intelligence to be able to manage different personalities and manage different situations so you're getting the best out of your team. And I think that happens in all walks of life, not just in science diplomacy, but in those particular instances, I definitely thought to myself, this is happening because you're very ingrained in your work, first and foremost. And secondly, it's happening because you are thinking about this as though you might have thought about some kind of grant or research proposal where you have multiple weeks, whereas I'm just thinking about it as I want to cross this thing off my to-do list, let's go. So yeah, some interesting personality differences, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Yeah, I know some people that are more, I don't want to say names or affiliations, but that come from scientific backgrounds and then kind of end up more in the policy diplomacy nexus. And uh, I heard, initial challenges, but of course both are well equipped with, project management and that maybe the time frame, as you were saying, Shandu, can be different for the different fields. Maybe with the scientific time frame, you have a lot more time to focus on your research. I mean, in diplomacy, it's much more. You have to have deliverables at the end of every day, presumably. But yeah, I think they are two very different worlds. I know Jan Marco Müller, who's the European Commission's focal point for science diplomacy. I've heard him say a few times how Europe is to a diplomat is different than Europe to a scientist, because Europe to a diplomat usually would be the 27 member states, whereas to a scientist it might be more the European research area, which is consisting of over 40 countries. So that is certainly one area where there's a difference. Obviously, with science, it's underpinned by like scientific method, like with these principles of universality and objectivity, rationality. I think in diplomacy, you're subject to more subjectivity, and a very big strength in diplomacy is strategic ambiguity. I mean, it was the strategic ambiguity that allowed the United States and the People's Republic of China to develop the Shanghai Communique, because they didn't really have an idea of what to do with Taiwan issue. So then they just leave it, strategically ambiguous. That I don't think resonates very well with the scientific mindset. Meanwhile, I think these aspects of rationality and objectivity and the scientific method of constantly questioning your assumptions in a diplomat's mindset, it might not help achieve diplomatic objectives. So, but looking at history, you can see some of the greatest science diplomats really just embodied both these scientific and diplomatic acumen. I like Benjamin Franklin, for example, who was ambassador of the colonies during the American Revolution. He was ambassador to France, but he was also a prolific scientist and an inventor, which definitely helped augment his diplomatic clout. And that's why in the opening slide of my presentation, there's a picture of Ben Franklin in the French court. And then Otto von Guercke, he was the German city of Magdeburg before Germany existed. It was during the 30 Years' War. He was the delegate from Magdeburg at the conferences that led to the Peace of Westphalia. And he was a prolific inventor himself. He developed the prototype of a vacuum, and arguably that helped his diplomatic profile, because everybody wanted to talk to him about this great invention that he came up with. So when you can kind of merge, your scientific and your diplomatic potential into one, that's really the sweet spot, I'd say.
Thank you so much. Thank you both of you for sharing these very hands-on experiences, either from most recently or from hundreds of years ago. It was very interesting to hear. Chandu?
Yeah, can I just come back on something? So I actually wanted to come back on something Eric said about adherence to this particular code. And the code is integrity, honesty, objectivity, and impartiality. And I actually think that these are very scientific, if you're thinking about it in terms of methodology and what stringent rules you're usually assigned, for example, in medical trials or something to that effect. It's actually not dissimilar. But I think the joining power is not just bringing these two rules together, because I actually think whether we're able to or not, they're general principles for life. Like we should try to operate with integrity. We should try to operate with honesty. We should try to be objective. We're obviously never going to be fully objective because we're biased people and we think about ourselves first and foremost. But we should. These are nice life rules to live by. But I actually think the desire or what makes you a good science diplomat is, and I said this slightly earlier, is your desire outside of all of this to help people. Because really, bridging two academics together that's working on something that is novel, exciting, interesting, or if you're a researcher sat in DeepMind and actually you want to work with a Laotian company that is just starting thinking about a Laotian large language model, the desire there should be to help people. It should not be exploitation. It should not be to do harm. It should be fundamentally to do the best that you possibly can so that there are positive outcomes on both sides.
Thank you so much for sharing this. This is very valuable. So we should go back to the basics, and that should be the same values for both communities. Okay, we have come to the end of the webinar. So let me invite both of you just to give a very short one-sentence word of advice. What is the thing that you think participants should remember from today's webinar? If there's only one thing, a word of encouragement or advice for them, then what would it be?
Eric, you go first. I've gone first every single time. I feel terrible. So you go
Okay,
first.
no worries. It gives me more time to think. But I just wanted to tie into what you just said. Actually, I think that's a really and how the purpose of science diplomacy should be to help communities, not exploitation, fair and equitable partnerships. I think that's a really excellent thing to keep in mind. But the thing I think I would like to leave our participants with is when we think about science diplomacy in this era of geopolitical fragmentation, I think we have to remember that knowledge itself needs its own diplomats. So whether you're a diplomat to encourage and empower scientists and researchers to engage in that diplomatic sphere, or if you're a scientist to realize that responsibility to advocate on behalf of the global commons of knowledge, because we can't take it for granted, especially in this area where competition and closeness are becoming more rife.
Thank you so much. And Chandu, what's your advice?
I think my advice is that whatever field that you're working in, whether you're a scientist, whether you're an international relations student, or you are someone even who has an anthropology background, let's say, science diplomacy is definitely a place where you can find your feet, you can find a career, you can find meaningful connections with people. Fundamentally, if you're interested in people, you're interested in helping, you're interested in development or geopolitics or economics, whatever it might be, there is a home and a space for you in science diplomacy. And I think science diplomacy is not that well known. I don't think that many people think about it as a career or think about it as, when they join the Foreign Service. I think people think about politics and people think about being a second secretary political or a first secretary political or a political counselor. No one thinks about being the regional director for science and technology. At least I didn't. But I think there are loads of happy careers and happy moments to be found in science diplomacy. So if you're thinking about it, delve deeper, and I'm sure you'll find a fantastic career.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Happy to close the session on an encouraging high note. Thank you so much for your insights. I think we learned a lot from you today about how to navigate this professional diversity and how the two worlds look like. And we also learned that they are actually not very different when we dig down back to the basics. So we should be all on the same page. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you being with us today. So big virtual round of applause to both of you. And let me give back the floor to Linnea to close the session.
Thank you very much, Rika. And again, on behalf of the HER Foundation and our education department, thank you so much to our two speakers for being with us here today. And thank you to our audience for being with us today as well. And apologies for some technical remarks on not being able to use the chat function, but now you can use it. And if you have time, send your LinkedIn in the chat to ensure that everyone can connect now towards the end with each other as well. But we have come towards the end of not only today's session, but also the whole training as a whole. So the webinar series is unfortunately concluding here today. As we mentioned in the beginning, we have covered a bunch of topics in the last 6-7 weeks. So if you're interested in revisiting any of the sessions that you joined live, but you want to hear in particular a section that was of interest to you, then you can visit the website and watch any of the recordings in your own time. With the participants who are joining us for the full training, we of course will see you later this week for our final training session on Thursday. But for all of the wonderful participants and attendees that have been with us today and throughout the last couple of weeks, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you've had a learning journey with us here, and that you take with you some new food for thought and perhaps some moments that you wish to build upon yourself in your own professional and personal careers. So thank you so much for being with us here today. We hope that we will be able to see you in another future event of ours, both within the Asia Europe Foundation as a whole, but in particular with us here at the Education Department. So keep a lookout also on our website and social media for any future activities related to science and technology diplomacy. With that, I would like to say goodbye, and I hope to see you again very soon. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. All right.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Bye, everyone.